An overzealous HOA enforcer stormed onto 82-year-old Dorothy Baines's porch, threatening fines and trespassing on land that was never under his control. Travis Riggins, drunk on false authority, thought a frail widow would be easy to intimidate, until she quietly lifted her quilt and revealed a 1943 Colt. What he didn't know, the sheriff was her godson, and the law was on her side. But just wait until you hear how this Georgia grandmother turned the tables, and why justice landed harder than anyone expected. It was a warm Tuesday morning when Travis Riggins crunched up the gravel path to Dorothy Baines's front porch, clipboard in hand and mirrored sunglasses reflecting the old oak trees overhead. He moved like he owned the land he walked on, shoulders squared, boots scuffing the dust just a little harder than necessary, as if every step needed to make a point. Dorothy watched him approach from her rocking chair, half-finished quilt in her lap, a quiet wren chirping in the feeder beside her. At 82, she looked exactly how Travis expected, small, silver-haired, wrapped in a sweater even in the sun, like she belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. And that was his mistake. For Travis, these visits had become a weekly ritual. Swing by a home just outside the HOA's official limits, flash the badge stitched onto his volunteer vest, and bark a few demands about paint color, lawn height, or whatever else he thought might get someone to fold. He liked to act like a deputy, but the truth was, Travis Riggins was a self-appointed compliance enforcer with no legal authority, just a laminated name tag and an overinflated sense of purpose. The HOA didn't pay him, but they didn't stop him either, and that was enough. Dorothy's property sat just beyond the official reach of Maple Ridge Estates. Her house had been there since the late 1950s, long before the HOA was even a thought. It was a modest, white clapboard home with green shutters, a well-tended flower bed of zinnias and snapdragons, a wooden bench under an oak tree, and an American flag waving softly on a short pole anchored in concrete. None of it flashy, none of it new, just honest, old Southern charm. But Travis wasn't here for charm. He stood at the foot of the porch and cleared his throat like a man expecting obedience. "Afternoon," he said, pretending to tip a non-existent hat. "We've had some concerns from the board about your property's, presentation. It's not in line with the aesthetic continuity expected by Maple Ridge." Dorothy blinked once, then resumed her stitching. "My house isn't part of Maple Ridge?" Travis smiled like someone correcting a toddler. "It's adjacent," he replied. "Visual adjacency grants the HOA advisory input on external features. You've got a bench under that tree that looks like it's from a junkyard, flower beds in non-standard formation, and the flagpole isn't on the approved list. If you don't bring it into compliance, you'll be fined. $200 a day, starting tomorrow, at—" Dorothy didn't argue. She didn't explain that her bench was hand-built by her late husband in 1971. She didn't point out that her flowers were planted the same way every spring for decades. She just said, in a voice barely louder than the breeze, "This is private property. You're trespassing." But Travis was already halfway up the porch, boots scraping the faded planks. "Ma'am, refusal to cooperate with a compliance officer can be reported as non-compliance. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Then he did something that tipped the balance. He stomped a foot down into her snapdragons, crushing a handful of blooms flat under his heel, and reached for the stack of mail sitting beside her rocking chair. "Don't touch that," she said. Still calm, still sitting. He scoffed. "I'm collecting evidence." But before his fingers reached the first envelope, Dorothy slowly lifted the edge of her quilt, just enough to reveal the worn wooden grip of a Colt .45 rested lightly in her lap. It gleamed under the Georgia sun, its surface well-oiled and handled with care. Her late husband had brought it home from Europe in 1946, and she had kept it legal, maintained, and ready, just in case life ever reminded her that peace was only possible when backed by resolve. Her voice didn't change pitch, but it dropped an octave, low and deliberate. "You have 5 seconds to get off my porch." Travis didn't move at first. He wasn't sure if it was real, if she was bluffing, or if this was some kind of joke. But the way she looked at him, steady, unflinching, as if she'd seen worse men do dumber things and outlasted every one of them, made his breath catch in his throat. And suddenly he remembered. Dorothy Baines wasn't some helpless old lady. She was a widow of a decorated war veteran, the daughter of a sheriff, and the kind of woman who understood the law better than most men half her age. Travis backed off the porch one slow step at a time, muttering about calling this in. Dorothy didn't raise the Colt. She didn't have to. She simply folded the quilt back over her lap, adjusted her glasses, and said, "That's the smartest thing you've done all day." For a moment, Travis didn't move. He stood on the porch like he'd stepped into another reality, one where things didn't go his way. The shaky bravado he'd carried up the steps evaporated the instant Dorothy showed she wasn't afraid of him, or of whatever empty title he thought gave him power. "Ma'am," he croaked, voice cracking as he pointed at her lap. "That's a threat. You just made a threat with a weapon." Dorothy didn't raise an eyebrow. "It's called a deterrent, sweetheart," she said evenly, "and I've had just about enough of little boys pretending to be lawmen on land they don't own and don't understand." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She spoke like someone who'd settled disputes long before cell phones and court summons became popular tools for conflict. Her words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Travis's hand twitched, like he wanted to pull out his phone and make a dramatic call, but he didn't have the nerve to look away from her just yet. After a few more seconds of awkward silence, he stumbled backward off the porch step, catching the toe of his boot on the edge and nearly pitching himself into the grass. He regained his balance just in time to bark, "I'm calling the sheriff. You'll regret this. You can't point a firearm at a compliance officer." What he didn't know, what he'd never even thought to ask, was that the sheriff of the county, Colton Marks, had been calling Dorothy Aunt Dot since he was 5 years old. She'd babysat him during flu season when his mom was working the night shift. She'd sent him care packages when he was in the academy. And more than anything, she'd taught him to respect people who minded their own business. By the time Travis finished dialing, Dorothy had already sent a text of her own. 10 minutes later, a white cruiser with gold trim pulled into the gravel driveway. The dust hadn't even settled when Sheriff Marks stepped out, all 6'3" of him, wearing his broad-brimmed hat like a crown he never asked for. His deputy, Carla, followed behind with the kind of quiet alertness that came from years of letting Colton do the talking. Travis jogged up to them like a man rushing to report a crime in progress. "Sheriff, I'm glad you're here. That woman—" He jabbed a finger toward the porch. "Eido just pointed a weapon at me for doing my job. I've got the right to report noncompliance, and she pulled a firearm over a newspaper." Colton didn't blink. He didn't ask for clarification. He just looked at Dorothy, then at Travis, then slowly removed his sunglasses and let the silence do most of the talking. "Travis Riggins," he said finally, "you called in a weapons violation?" "Yes, sir. That's right. She had a gun. She threatened me." Dorothy stood from her chair, the quilt still folded neatly over one arm. In her other hand she held a small flash drive and an old photo tucked in a protective sleeve. She stepped down from the porch, handed both to Carla without a word, and returned to her seat. Carla plugged the flash drive into her cruiser's onboard system. Within seconds, the ring footage played back on the dashboard screen. Travis stepping on her flowers, Travis reaching for her mail, Travis ignoring a clear verbal warning to leave private property. Then, the still shot from the week before, a grainy but unmistakable image of him crouched near her hydrangeas with a phone flashlight, clearly outside HOA bounds. Colton didn't even look at the screen. He just kept his eyes on Travis. "Son," he said, not unkindly, "you've got about 2 minutes to stop lying. Otherwise, I'm going to show you exactly what interfering with a protected property line looks like in this county." Travis opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't know if it was the badge, the silence, or the weight of a community that had known Dorothy Baines longer than he'd been out of high school, but something broke inside him. Maybe it was the realization that he wasn't the authority here. He was the problem. Colton took one slow step forward. "You're not on the HOA payroll. You're not deputized. You're not recognized by this county in any official capacity. And that woman?" He nodded toward the porch. "That woman is fully within her rights to defend her home from trespass, verbal harassment, and theft." Travis's shoulders slumped. His hands went to his pockets, and for the first time all day, he looked small, very small. The moment Sheriff Marks opened the back door of the cruiser, Travis Riggins hesitated, still clinging to the last scrap of his imagined authority. But there were no more tricks left to play, no badges to flash, no neighbors to intimidate. He ducked inside without another word, eyes fixed on the floorboards. Dorothy didn't stand until the cruiser's engine turned over. Her movements were slow, stiff from years of gardening and winters spent alone. But when she rose from the rocking chair, there was no shakiness in her posture. She walked to the edge of the porch, rested one hand on the rail, and stared straight at Travis through the cruiser window. "You don't come back here," she said, her voice like dry pine cracking in a fireplace. "Not unless you're ready to apologize, and you'd better start with my begonias." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was a line in the sand, firm, final, and carved in the kind of dignity that only comes with age and unshakable self-respect. By the next morning, the wheels of accountability were already turning. The county zoning office, spurred by a call from Sheriff Marks himself, issued a formal statement declaring that Dorothy Baines's property had never fallen under the governance of the Maple Ridge HOA. Any suggestion to the contrary was incorrect and without legal basis. The sheriff's department confirmed the report of a false complaint. Travis's self-proclaimed role as compliance enforcer was deemed entirely unauthorized and unlawful. The HOA board, previously content to let Travis be their volunteer muscle, found themselves in a storm they hadn't prepared for. Residents had tolerated his behavior for years because it kept their hands clean. He issued veiled threats about paint codes and lawn measurements. He reported violations that never existed. And because it was easier to let him play enforcer than deal with the mess of stopping him, they looked the other way. Now they couldn't ignore it. Under pressure from both the county and angry residents, the board released a written apology, printed on cheap cardstock, and slid under mailboxes like flyers. It was signed by the president and 2 committee members, stiffly worded, almost reluctant, but an apology nonetheless. They acknowledged the overreach. They deeply regretted any confusion. They thanked Miss Baines for her grace under pressure. But Dorothy wasn't satisfied with a paper apology. She wasn't looking to make noise, but she knew the difference between keeping quiet and being silenced. With help from her late husband's old Army buddy, a retired paralegal who'd spent his career handling local property cases, Dorothy filed for a restraining order against Travis. It passed without challenge. He was barred from coming within 200 feet of her property and within 50 feet of her mailbox. Next, she demanded that the HOA remove all reference to her name and address from any community correspondence. Not a footnote, not a mention in a newsletter. Her land was sovereign, and she wanted it recognized as such. Finally, and with some hesitation, she agreed to speak with a local news reporter. They met at her kitchen table. No studio lights, no dramatics, just 2 cups of black coffee, a notepad, and the truth. Dorothy told the story plainly, how Travis had crossed the line, how the system had tolerated it, and how a quiet woman with a long memory and steady hands reminded everyone where that line actually was. A week later, the article ran under the headline, "Grandma with a Colt sends enforcer packing." The photo showed Dorothy sitting under her oak tree, Quilt in her lap, the shadow of her flag just visible in the background. No gun, no bravado, just a woman who'd decided that enough was enough, and who knew exactly how to defend what was hers. By the end of the month, the Maple Ridge HOA board had all but dissolved its unofficial enforcement task force. Their bluff had been called, and not just by Dorothy Baines, but by the broader community that had grown weary of quiet abuses parading as policy. No more unannounced visits, no more half-baked warnings tucked under doormats. The board issued a new resolution, barring any volunteer or board member from engaging in enforcement of any kind without written county-approved authorization. Travis Riggins, once the self-proclaimed sheriff of the sidewalk, was formally banned from representing the HOA in any capacity, ever again. Dorothy didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself, and now it echoed through the town like a bell that couldn't be unrung. 1 week later, her garden was nominated, then unanimously selected, by the town's historical committee as a preserved heritage lot. The recognition wasn't just for its age or arrangement, but for its representation of traditional homestead aesthetics in defiance of modern overreach. A small wooden sign was placed at the edge of the flower bed beneath her oak tree. It read, "The Baines Garden, established 1958, preserved by integrity, protected by principle." And then there was the Colt. Dorothy hadn't waved it around. She hadn't discharged it. She hadn't so much as raised her voice. But the presence of that pistol, worn smooth by time and care, once carried by her husband across Europe, had made a statement no amount of shouting could match. The historical committee offered to frame it, and she agreed, on one condition, that it be placed in the town library beside a copy of the article that told the full story. And so it was mounted behind glass, above a walnut plaque engraved in clean serif letters, "Defender of Peace and Peonies, property of Mrs. Dorothy Baines." When a local reporter asked her in a follow-up interview why she had kept the Colt under a quilt, Dorothy's eyes twinkled just slightly as she answered, "Because some men only understand boundaries when you show them one." That line made the front page of the Sunday edition, not in bold type, not in scandalous headlines, but as a quiet quote in the corner of a feature titled, "When Grace Draws the Line." And in the months that followed, something shifted in town. Neighbors who had once whispered complaints about HOA letters now spoke openly about overreach. Other elders found the courage to question decisions they'd previously endured in silence. Even the new HOA president, a younger woman named Claire Jennings, personally visited Dorothy with a homemade pie and a formal apology, handwritten in ink. Justice hadn't come through spectacle. It had arrived quietly, like the first breeze after a long storm. No one had shouted. No one had been harmed. But something powerful had been restored. In that quiet, dusty corner of Georgia, where flowers still bloomed beneath the old oak and a quilt still lay folded across a porch chair, everyone knew one simple truth. You didn't mess with Dorothy Baines, not because she was armed, but because she was right,